started again, so you're.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Spin Rack. I'm here with the boys PD and Cal, and I'm talking about the early life of our man himself, Stan Lee, from the book A Marvelous Life by Danny Fingeroth. So I was going to ask into once again to our resident experts and stuff. As I'm reading this book, I'm starting to realize Fingeroth clearly, who was a writer and an editor at Marvel, um, and definitely close to, it seems in this book, he's definitely close to Stan Lee and stuff like that. But one thing that I'm realizing is that how young Stan Lee started as a writer at Marvel, and how young he was when he became the editor for the magazine, for the news, for the comics.
Now,
Even though,
Mark is also, we're supposed to be doing a video later comparing that to this book where they point out how bad Stan Lee was and everything he did wrong, but he wanted to jump the gun. So
no, I'm not, this is just a little thing I wanted to just touch base on. That
base about what?
Well, kill it,
About
PD.
this thing,
Yes,
this book right here, that we
yes.
had a plan and you're totally trying to take the thunder out of it. But
No,
let's go.
then you know what? Stop the video. So
No, we're recording. We can't stop it now.
No, I'm just saying the one thing I noticed about the book though is how young he was, and the very fact that Ditko was there at the beginning and left before he became the editor.
Who are you saying? Who? You said Ditko?
Not Ditko. Shucks. Who was I talking about?
Kirby?
Kirby. Yeah. Hello?
Yeah. Who you talking? Which one?
Yeah, Kirby. He was there before. Kirby, I think, and Simon were there already working for Goodman, who was the owner of Timely, and was also the owner of Marvel at the time.
Yep.
So the fact that they left shortly after he had started as the
how did they leave? Did they have it? Because I haven't got. What did they say? What happened when they left?
We're not going into details there, but the point about this is that the very fact that he started pretty young and he had a different take on how to do this. He basically worked into the job as opposed to the job was already filled and this is what you were supposed to do. He helped develop many of the systems that would later become what they always call the Marvel way and stuff like that going forward. And it's pretty.
But he learned from Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, especially Joe Simon.
But they came back.
No. When they were there and Stanley got the job, he was their gopher.
Right, exactly.
He watched them do everything, and then when they were fired, Stan took over.
They left.
No, they were planning on leaving, and then supposedly Kirby always said it was Stan, but
But Stan said no. He said he didn't think that was the case. He said everybody knew what was going on. So
yeah, right.
So what? Simon just changed his tune. Why wouldn't he agree? He says no.
Simon saying that?
Yeah, that's what he said. He's like, yeah, he didn't think that he was the one. He said it was just an open secret.
Kirby thinks he was the one. Everyone on the Kirby side said it was Stan. Stan, of course, because he's related. That's what they keep saying. Sorry, I'm undermining what you're saying. Keep going.
No, I'm not undermining at all. I'm just saying you're right. That's exactly. I didn't want to go into details of that, but I just wanted to just touch base that we were talking to someone earlier, and the guy was like, "Oh well, Stan just came into a brand new organization, and everything was already set up for they had people there." And I'm like, "No, Stan came into the organization, but he basically was the one who helped to set up a lot of the things that would eventually make it a successful comic book company. Some of the talent was already there, but he brought a lot of them into it also." That's what I wanted to basically say. I mean, you agree, you disagree with that statement there?
That comes later. As a business, he was running it obviously with Martin Goodman's approval. So you had all those years where he was just buying stories and inventorying them, and he was making a ton of money, even though they weren't bigger than anyone else. He was just, he was living the good life until comics crashed, and they had to stop. He had to let everyone know that they couldn't get any work. So it's like, that's not necessarily, it's it wasn't prepared for the crash and had to let everybody go. So that's in all the businesses. But so there wasn't like a system in place to deal with the crash, even though the comic book, so in the 40s, I guess the sort of You had the boom in the 40s, I guess. Yeah, the boom in the 40s. It would have started in the late 30s. So boom in the 40s, the crash in the 50s. There's no really where to prepare for it. But you know, Stan Lee was on a shoestring budget and these inventory stories, and he still kept his best friend in there. But then it's after when Kirby comes back, that's when they start. It's everyone in place though. They have Martin Goodman kind of putting his ideas. Stan Lee already has his brother in there, and Kirby is just ready to work on everything. So those things are sort of in place. He already was, I guess, writing with Ditko and plotting for his brother. And then ultimately those sort of things turn into the Marvel style. So yeah, pretty much. But that comes in the 60s. So I say all that to say the stuff he put in place really starts to come into play in the 60s, or late 50s, 60s during the Atlas time. So yeah, long-winded way of saying it.
No, I agree. But the question is, when did they come back to Marvel again and then
Cool.
start to Kirby and Simon?
Kirby came back 57 after he was basically persona non grata at DC. So he was looking to get other work. He got work with Simon. Simon's thing was very small, and Stan Lee, basically the way Kirby says it is that they were tearing everything down, and he told them he'd get it start running again. Ultimately, from I guess Stan hadn't said much, he just started giving him more work, and Stan Lee's brother said, you know, Kirby was faster than we could write for, so that's why Stan called me in.
So the key point that I wanted to make here, and Petey just elaborated on that, and Cal, if you want, you can jump in, is that, you know, when Stan Lee started, they were already part of the show, right?
Yep.
They left shortly thereafter.
Yep.
So after that, he comes in and now becomes, shortly after that, he becomes the editor, you know, basically.
Yep.
Or he was Martin Goodman's, you know, he would do whatever Martin Goodman wanted him to do, basically. So he was covering that, or he was the eyes and ears of the organization. But as time went on, he grew into the role in and of itself. So as the editor. So by the time, and we're talking about what, this was 1940s, early 1940s. By the time Kirby comes back in the 1950s, he's running the show, right?
Yeah.
He had over 10, 20, not 10 years, yeah, over 10 years worth of experience around that period of running the show. So when he comes back and he starts working with Kirby and they collaborate on the Hulk and Thor and of course, one of the greatest characters Marvel has ever made, Dr. Doom, you know.
We'll say Spider-Man, not Dr. Doom, Lord.
Cal, can you back me up on this, bro?
You're supposed to say Spider-Man, not Dr. Doom.
Okay, clearly, then, you know, I take your silence.
Why don't you just say the Red Skull for all of that?
Magneto.
Wow.
Ego the Living Planet. We go there.
Okay, yeah. Well, you like your villains, no problem. You and my dad would get along.
Galactus. You know, I mean, come on. So what I'm just trying to say is that by that time, goes along with what we were talking before, that it was already the Stan Lee way and how he was working with Kirby, on how he was working with his artists. And therefore, where Kirby goes back and says, no, these successes are not his, you know, these were mine and I did it by myself. It's kind of a bit of faulty argument.
Okay, so then we're going into that now. It's the hard part of it is that you know, Kirby had a hand in it, you know, as far as obviously if you had to give him co-creating status because, you know, Stan did not design the characters and Kirby added a lot to them. So and he was one of the initial artists, same with Ditko and Don Heck. But ultimately, this fight has become between Stan Lee and Jack Kirby.
And that's not where I'm trying to get to, people.
Why do you say that?
That's going to be a little down the road. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Marvel way had already been started, and Lee had been overseeing multiple comics and titles at the time. And
it hadn't really started unless you count Ditko. Because ultimately, Stan did write scripts for the guys. We don't have his was a Manley, that artist, to talk to since he passed before Marvel's got famous. But Ditko said they basically were, you know, I think Stan was working with Ditko where he was giving them plots, but he probably didn't initially start doing that. So he didn't really call it the Marvel method, but he liked working with Ditko. So he would send him plots and then, Stan would write the script later. For Kirby, he would give his brother the plot. The brother would write a script. The brother would then Kirby would do it. And it's not until I think the Rawhide Kid where Stan and Jack worked together, and they probably started working Marvel. But that's not really official sort of thing. It's just something Stan was doing. Even though editors kind of did that from time to time, because editors would give them stories, and/or editors who could give you a springboard, that sort of thing. Stan is the only guy who was just trying to maximize his time instead of writing out a full script for it and write descriptions, knowing that the artist is going to fill in the blanks for everything anyway. So he could just say, person goes into the house explodes. That's really, even though you look at Fantastic Four plot, it's very more involved than what I just did, but it sometimes be more dense, sometimes it be less. So yeah, you can say it's in place, but it was something he was kind of doing on the fly. Say all that to say.
Cal?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think one of the things that's always overlooked when it comes to Stan Lee is forgetting that Stan Lee was an editor, and not for one book, but for all of them.
Yes.
So when Marvel jumpstarts with Fantastic Four, there were already books being published. Okay, there were other books already being published. You had horror comics that were being published. You had the other imprints such as Journey into Mystery and Tales of Two Astonished. These books were already being published at that time, and he was overseeing all of that. And then when you had the new stuff coming in, okay, he still had his hands are on everything. So when someone's talking about, oh, well, he didn't do this, like, no, this guy was not just doing, plotting or dialogue, writing or what have you, but he was also overseeing all of those books at the end of the day, because his editor was still like, okay, there's still numbers that these books need, like, let's look at where these books are in terms of numbers. Okay, let's make a couple changes here. What are we getting in terms of the mail? There's all this stuff that he still had to do coming there. That's one of the reasons for the Marvel method. That's one of the reasons for the Marvel method as it was. That's a converse difference with someone like a Mort Wessinger, where Mort Wessinger was more of a traditional editor, where he oversaw the books, but he wasn't writing stuff. What Mort Wessinger did, which was creative, but at the same time, maybe a little tyrannical for the writers, he would come up and he would tell the artists, make up a really wild cover. And then he would show the writers the cover and say, now make a story to come up, to go along with that cover. So you would see some of these wild covers in, the Silver Age, and you're like, okay, why are these covers so wild? Because that was the edict. Come up with these really wild covers. Now come up with the story to go with that. And that was the way that to push and challenge the writers. Stan, okay, Stan was the major writer on all this stuff. And I think that's and I really think that's overlooked, for the most part. So when he's coming in, and the other thing to understand is, like, he's coming in, like Petey said, with this real basic plot, like, okay, Fantastic Four, we see them at the Baxter Building, a villain shows up, a bunch of stuff happens, okay, and then it ends on a cliffhanger. And there's that really basic thing right over there, and he gives it over to Kirby and says, okay, like, draw me some art based on this. At any point, Kirby comes up with the story, Kirby comes up with the pages and so on and so forth. He was still the editor. So he was the guy who was like, this doesn't work. This has to be done over. Okay, this doesn't come over here. This doesn't come up. And a lot of that stuff was because of the time and all the books that he was overseeing, and then still coming up with the dialogue for all of it at the end of the day. So he's not, I think that's very much overlooked. I don't know if he gets the credit he should receive as an editor, in addition to being, co-creator on a lot of that stuff. But I think that's absent from a lot of the estimation that people put on Stan Lee, be it positive or otherwise. That's something that's really not taken into account.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's I was looking at the writing, but more the editing, and the fact that he was involved in quite a few titles, and that when Kirby came back, there was already a system set up in a format, because he had been in charge for quite a while, from being their assistant. And so Kirby, it seemed, could not look past that he was their assistant when they first started?
No, Kirby, the thing is like this. Kirby joked about it when everything was going well. He said we worked with him and he was a kid, he was a gopher. And he kept coming to us and saying different things. He said, we told him, go out there and go out there, get out of here, kid, and go out there and be an editor. And then that's what he did. He did that. And there's interviews where the two of them talk, and it's not this vile thing of them saying each other as collaborators. And obviously, since they both had ideas and they both saw themselves as sort of the lead guy, even though they saw themselves as that. But it's that point, there was one point where they both, especially Stan, had a great deal of respect for Kirby. And Kirby at the same time had respect for Stan, but at the same time, he was also struggling with him because he's the editor. So there's points where Stan would reject things, say redraw things, as Cal said, and that he would go home and he'd be mad at Stan. And slowly that built up to being more, because it's like, not because he had any issue because he was this gopher that's now the editor. It's just the basic wear and tear of having a collaboration where you come in there and then next thing you know, he starts singing. Then he stopped reading the books altogether when it came out in print. He was just like, he just draw them and they say, whatever it is, right? It wasn't a thing where he'd go back and fight. There's only two things that they had the biggest issue. But they had a small thing of an editor and someone griping. So it wasn't like, oh, this kid, I can't stand him. It was like more like over time, it just soured. And they had a stretch from 57 to actually, I guess it got bad in 67. So that's 10 years when it was decent. Where Kirby was ultimately a company man. He went to court when the copyrights for Captain America was up. He went on the side of Marvel. And people kind of put it like, oh, Joe Simon should have said something. It's like, Kirby knows what right is right. That he was co-creator. Well, he didn't understand that. So Joe Simon told him later, it's like, hey, whatever I made from it, you were supposed to make too. You co-created Captain America with me. We worked on that together. But Kirby said in the courtroom that, hey, Joe Simon did Captain America on our premises. It's a character that's owned by that. That's all the stuff that wasn't asking for with Marvel. He just wanted Marvel to say, hey, I created everything from scratch. So he was definitely a guy they would call him up in 2 seconds. Hey, Kirby, somebody messed up. Can you give us a Captain America story, a full story? Yeah, okay, here is Captain America, what is it, 111 or whatever, the 112. Here's 112, a history issue, origin of Captain America. Again, when they already did it like 6 issues before that. So they called him for covers. They sent him cover sketches. He would do them. He was very much for the company. And then until, a couple of things, he kind of fell from. So then you're getting the reaction later, being separated from them. And then at some point, he started just saying it was all him. And that's the thing that we only hear in the 80s. So we don't have a lot of interviews where he kind of talked about the creation. We only have Stan. And Stan at the time said they both were collaborators. He said, Kirby, send him story. So it wasn't, Stan was trying to keep him happy. And in Rolling Stones, when they were interviewed, Stan was very upset that Kirby left. This is before the Funky Flashman. He was still reeling from Kirby not being there. So, but that's the basic editor thing of saying even people, as Cal was talking about, Mort Wessinger, that people were struggling working with him. I think Shooter left DC a couple times through that. So it's like, and that tough attitude that Shooter has is what he learned from Mort Wessinger. So like the editors can be tough. Harvey Kurtzman had the best talent in comics. Jack Davis, Wally Wood, and he looked at their stuff when the historical stuff, and they would do different trees. They would do different trees when the historical places they were. Beautiful stuff. But Harvey Kurtzman was like, those are not the right trees. They don't have pine. Like, kids don't care. But in his description, it's very rigid on these very strong storytellers. So that's how editors are. Editors have to be tough. Ultimately, editors are supposed to be where you don't write your stuff. You write to the editor. You write to make sure the editor likes what you do. And you can kind of feel that's how Kirby was going about his plots, because when you see the Fantastic Four stuff, it's so sort of straightforward. And when you get to the New Gods stuff, it's everything that's on Kirby's mind at the time. He's not condensing it into anything. He's just like new character. And he would do that at times where there'd be a character Thor fights and Thor take him out on the page and move on. But there's some sort of cohesion in there. And there's somewhere either the times where Kirby was doing more on his end, he probably was still thinking of working towards an editor. What's going to get by Stan? What Stan is going to ask me to redo, that sort of thing. What's going to be really clean and concise. And you can see when it got to DC, it was just like all ideas at once, all at one time. So, in my opinion.
But that's interesting when you compare him to what's the Mortimer Weisinger,
More Weisinger, yeah.
Mort Weisinger, where you don't hear those crazy abusive stories about you hear the stories about him and how he treated people versus how our friend did.
No credit, you didn't get any credits. Basically saying, "Oh, your story, Shooter, your story. I gotta fix all your." No, he said, Carrie Bates stuff is way better than your stuff. Carrie Bates, I gotta fix all your stuff. I don't have to fix any of Shooters, like that sort of thing, like back and forth.
He found Shooter, didn't he?
Yeah, he found him and he put him through the motions. He would just, and I think that's the way Shooter worked with Marvel, because I think Byrne and Miller were both saying at some point they would Shooter would say something they were doing wrong, and then next thing you know, he'd move on to something else. He'd say, "Oh, I must have got something else right," because he stopped complaining about that and he went to something else. And it's like, wait a second, you didn't talk about the other thing that I was getting right. So it's like that sort of stuff. But I don't think as far as he didn't go as far as Mort Weisinger, because they really say that was Shooter didn't go as far as Mort Weisinger. I don't think he told someone your stuff sucks compared to this other person. He was
that was Weisinger. Weisinger liked to play everybody against each other in the hopes that that he would get oh, well, watch this. This is my competition. I'm gonna blow this guy out the water over here. But that I mean, what Weisinger brought in terms to DC, in terms of streamlining a lot of the continuity, making certain that, okay, these are who these characters are. You're going to adhere to this. He was instrumental because he oversaw like the Superman books, and he was instrumental in cleaning up a lot of that continuity. He was like, okay, look, because he was getting the letters from the kids and they would ask these questions. He was like, look, if they're confused, they're not enjoying the story. So, this is where it starts, this, that, and the other, and so on and so forth. And he cleaned a lot of that up. But that was also like the foundation for actually having a consistent continuity, because and with a lot of these comics, because for a long period of time, you could just come up with a new. I mean, it's the difference between Lex Luthor having red hair and being bald, and then trying to explain all this stuff going all the way back to those initial stories. Stan's thing was much more collaborative with credits that didn't happen for the most part. When they say the Jack Kirby is the king, it was Stan who gave him that moniker. That was the first, Stan comes over, Jack King Kirby at the end of the day. So, you have those attributes right there. I mean, what was instituted with Stan, well, it's really Stan and Jack. That's the one that everybody looks at, even though, of course, he collaborated with other artists as well, including his brother, but it's the Stan and Jack stuff. That's the one that really that's the one that stands out the most for everybody, probably particularly for that run on that 100-issue run that they did with the Fantastic Four, and all the creative stuff that came out of that. But you look at that, and it was just a much more collaborative. It was a much more collaborative experience, I would have to say, from what I've read and in practice, as opposed to what had been done earlier to that, in comparison to what was being done, say at DC, or even of any of the other comic companies at that point. I mean, if you just look at the credits alone, it was a market difference at the end of the day.
I mean, and so the key thing overall is what I was just trying to show is just that it wasn't just the Kirby Stan Lee, but that there was a lot of other things going on. Being that Stan Lee had stated Marvel, being that also Mort was the archetype for the editor. You know what I'm trying to say? Where he was such a particular type of person, and what the industry standard was, I guess, or accepted, and where Stan Lee, like you said before, he was writing, he was involved in all the titles, he was doing more than just doing one thing in particular. So
Those guys, I mean, those guys, those editors at that time, and this is probably editors overall, but those guys were tough.
Yeah.
Okay, you come up with something, yeah, you think it's great. I mean, even Stan Lee, like what's one of the stories? Stan Lee was working with John Buscema, excellent artist. If you've seen John Buscema's art, some beautiful stuff that is overlooked by a lot of people today in terms of some classic art. Most of the time these guys go after John Buscema stuff. They're like, oh, it's that one book over here with the cover, and that'll be the end of it. There's a ton of stuff that he did, but he did Stan and John Buscema did every issue of the first series of the Silver Surfer up until the last issue, which he did with Jack Kirby. And issue number 4, that's a sought after issue. That's a big book. It's expensive if you got to buy it. The cover, everybody loves it. The interiors, everybody loves it. And John Buscema turned that in. Stan was like, "Oh, this is bad. Look at this. This is bad. This is bad. This is terrible. Bang, bang. No, I don't like any of this." Some years go by, and I guess Stan looks at the book. He looks at the book again, and he's like, "Yeah, this is really good stuff." And I think he calls up John Buscema. He's like, "Hey, this is the best book you ever did was Silver Surfer #4." He was like, "Well, that's not what you told me." He's like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "What do you mean that's not what I told you?" He's like, "No, you told me you hated it." He was like, "That can't be." He was like, "Yes, it can, because that's what you told me at the end of the day." But, and again, you could attribute that to just a bad day. But, even Stan, these guys were tough. Stan was tough on his own brother. Larry Lieber turned in stuff, and he was like, "No." He was like, "No, no, no. This is how it's done. This is how you're going to, this is how the story comes along, art, this, that, and the other." But that was part of being editor. Those guys were tough because at the end of the day, they wanted these books to sell. Okay, they wanted these books to sell. They were all, I mean, if a book wasn't selling, that came back to the editor as to like, well, what are the kids saying in terms of the letters? What's going on over here? Is this story, is there actual story going on? So there was that aspect of it went too. And again, like I said earlier, not enough credit for the success as an editor, because all those ideas that came out of Marvel, okay, had to be executed in a manner which these people were going to be able to consume them. It wasn't just, hey, I got an idea, Spider-Man, and everybody was like, oh yeah, great. Okay, that stuff still has to get out to the public in a consumable manner.
Well, if you the other thing is like this. Ultimately, the only way to get creative freedom, in which Stan said to his brother, was on Rawhide Kid. He said, "It's selling so bad, I won't, I won't even edit it. You could do whatever you want because nobody's going to read it," like that sort of thing. So there's not much. If you're doing well, they're going to want to sort of look at it and step on it and do things to it. And at the same time, Stan also had to answer to Martin Goodman, because they say, Ditko says when they're doing Sergeant Fury, like, because they talk about it and they say, I think who's that guy? I forget who said it was when Martin Goodman came to Stan and said, "Hey, can you do a war story like the Fantastic Four?" And he's like, "Yeah." And you can see on the first cover, in the style of the Fantastic Four, is the blurb on there. And then Ditko asked him, "Well, why are you doing a war comic?" He's like, "Martin wanted me to do a war comic." That sort of thing. So it's like one of the things where this creator part, which is like, now that is a thing where we get into a hard part, because ultimately, if you guys seen The Search for Ditko, you guys see that documentary?
I haven't seen it yet.
So in that thing, the basic thing is, which they call Stan Lee on Hot Clothes for, because he says, initially, the guy with the initial idea that, he kind of has the thing of saying that he feels ultimately it's our collaboration, it's our co-creator. I consider these guys co-creator, but I think the guy who dreams it up is the guy, meaning himself, right? And they kind of want to go at him for that, to say, ultimately, every time you hear him in interviews, he says, I did the work with the great creators, this, that, and the other, Ditko, Kirby, and this, that, and the other. But they wanted him at one point where he says, you know what? Ultimately, I'm the guy who dreamed that up. And he's like, he said, well, what happened? Whatever you did it with another artist and it wasn't successful, then it just be something that wasn't successful. But that sort of thing has been like the thing that they've been holding on him to say, aha. He said, but at the same time, without looking at that, you got a guy who put the credits in the books, right? He put the credits in the books. Ultimately, people point, well, because he was already signing his name to his work in general, but at the same time, not his real name, but his pen name, but he's signing his name to his work. And at the same time, when Kirby got mad at that point of the article, he was going out saying Kirby is a writer on this thing too, that sort of thing. And then ultimately at the end, before they left, he let him write the Inhumans. So he'd do anything he could to keep him at Marvel. You always saw him. And it's not until Funky Flashman where he stopped kind of saying Jack was the best, like looking at him as his default as the best artist. But they, such a biting critique on him. So
I think we covered that. This is just a quick intro to this. Just want to say thank you guys. Spinnerack
out.
So Petey, this is just to be saved. Don't publish this at all.
Why can't I publish it?